Chapter 18, Genetics and Epigenetics. I want to explain a little bit about epigenetics because epigenetics is a trendy word because similar to genetics, it has something to do with inheritance, something to do with control of a body and something to do with diseases. And while genetics have the problems, you're born with a genetic defect, you're going to die with the genetic defect, there's no way of changing it. Epigenetics has the potential for you to change your epigenetic programming through the right lifestyle changes. And this is why it has become the subject of lots of books and interesting articles. And I want to explain what epigenetics is, what the status of science is, and how it compares to genetics as a sort of background information in the field of genetics. Now, epigenetics, if you compare it to genetics, genetics is really the blueprint of your body. So the genes contain information how to do a certain process. There is a gene that has the instruction of how food is digested. There is a gene that regulates blood sugar levels. There are genes which control what color your eyes should have and how strong bones are built. So really, one gene has a certain function, maybe a few more functions, and the gene has the instruction for the body how to do this. If you have a defective gene, a genetic variation or a mutation that disrupts this information, you lose this function in your body and it can cause a disease. Now, epigenetics also is on the genetic level. It is not really a change of the genetic code of a gene, but it's kind of like a volume control. If you imagine a speaker, the gene broadcasts its instruction of how the body should digest a certain food constituent, and epigenetics is a volume control, so it can turn the information louder or quieter. And this is what epigenetic programming does. It can really increase the activity or reduce the activity of a gene. So environmental factors can influence the programming of epigenetics. That's the interesting thing. So some environmental factors can make genes louder, others can make them quieter, and these louder and quieter genes can then influence processes in the body. So it's a regulation of genes. And what's also interesting, even though it is the environmental factor that influences my genetics, that modifies this volume control, it can be passed on. Scientists used to think genetics is just you choose genes by randomly, then you pass them on to your children, and whatever gene combination they get, that's what they're going to live with. However, really the things that I do in my lifetime before I have children can also be passed on genetically and inherited. That's the interesting thing about this. Now, the first effect of epigenetics was observed in the records of the Netherlands. In the 1940s, that was after the war, there was a famine, and there were Dutch women which were pregnant at this time and had very little food, so only 400 kilocalories per day. And they made it through this famine period. They brought they gave birth to their children, and the children then grew up. They already had more food again, so they had a normal diet. When they grew up to be adults, scientists found that they had a higher rate of heart disease, breast cancer, and obesity. Now, you wouldn't be surprised, because during the time, the most important developmental time that their body started to develop, they were restricted of nutrients, and that caused this, so you wouldn't be surprised that this is happening. However, what they then found is that when they gave birth, and even though they had enough food while their babies were in the embryo stage, when they gave birth to children and they grew up, they also had an increased risk of heart disease, breast cancer, and obesity. And that was interesting, because it was not their embryo that was exposed to this problem, but it was one generation ago. So really, this environmental factor of too little food has changed the genes somehow, that this this negative effect was passed on. And this was the first good demonstration of how epigenetics can be inherited and how it can influence our health. So, okay, now looking at a gene, if we look at the lactose digestion gene, for example, the lactase gene, the gene itself has the information to tell the body how to digest lactose. It's the building plan, really the blueprint for an enzyme that digests lactose. Now, epigenetics comes along as heterochromatin. You can imagine it as a kind of substance that grabs onto the genes and to the genetic code and silences it, reduces the volume of this gene. So really the information for the body is down-regulated. It becomes very quiet. And if you now have a person thinking again about this famine situation, you had a person with a number of genes that had a number of functions. This person then had progeny, and the progeny also had the genes with the function. And then each one of these functions was carried out by the gene. However, then this person was exposed to famine, to very little food for a long period of time. And then epigenetics started to silence or reduce the activity of some of the genes. This heterochromatin latched onto the genes and started silencing them. And then this person had children and passed on this epigenetic programming. This heterochromatin silencing was passed on, even though this new person was not exposed to the same environmental factors. So this can be passed on. So now the question is, if epigenetics can turn on or can turn genes on or off, doesn't that overrule genetics? Some people claim so. They say genetics is old stuff, we don't need that anymore. Epigenetics is the future. But if you look at the gene, if the gene has a genetic variation or a genetic defect, it loses its information about lactose digestion. So this information is gone. And it doesn't matter if you activate it or deactivate it with heterochromatin, this information is gone. So yes, epigenetics does have an effect. Maybe a little bit about my background. I myself am a epigeneticist, really. I've done some experiments in the lab. I have completely switched off genes, firefly genes, with epigenetic programming. So this is something that I know is very powerful. It can completely turn off genes with the right epigenetic programming. However, if you have a mutation in a gene, there's no way to rescue it. So in some ways, epigenetics has a strong influence. It definitely has a strong influence. However, if the genetics lose the information, there's nothing epigenetics can do to rescue this information. And that's the concept of epigenetics. It is undoubtedly an important effect. However, scientifically speaking, we know how to measure the epigenetic silencing of a gene and see how loud it is regulated, really. However, it is tissue specific. So this effect might only be in the brain or only in the muscle cells or only in other tissues. So to measure it, you need a biopsy of the tissue to measure how loud or how quiet this gene is. And we are just not there with the science to find out how this epigenetic programming works or how it can be influenced in a person. We do observe some effects where certain environmental factors, when we're babies or when we're growing up, have some effect. We do know that certain healthy lifestyles can improve epigenetics. We don't know enough yet to create personalized programs based on epigenetics because it's just difficult to measure. So epigenetics is a thing that will become more in the future. Much of the epigenetic programming is going to improve through the environmental modifications that we make with the prevention programs. So epigenetics will be a part of the program. scientists or science just doesn't know enough about it yet to really measure it and give personalized recommendations based on the genetic programming. So epigenetics is interesting. Genetics is what we know a lot about, and genetics is what we can measure reliably. We can already get a lot of information, useful information, and information that we can use to personalize a prevention program. And that's the end of chapter 18, Epigenetics and Genetics.